Welcome everybody to the getAbstract webinar on the topic Remote Work, Rising Stress and the Critical Need for Connection. I assume that for most of you it's rather early in the day. For some of you it's afternoon anyway. Thank you so much for joining and for your interest in our expert talk today. My name is Ramona Macinetti and our guest author today is Michael Stallard. Welcome, Michael. You are the president and co-founder of the Connection Culture Group and an expert in organizational culture. Ever since you left the technology sector on Wall Street, you've been working as a keynote speaker, trainer, executive coach, and consultant. The summary of your outstanding book, Connection Culture, the second edition of which was published in 2020, is to be found in the getAbstract library. I can only recommend to our viewers to read the book. Its framework is very applicable, as you will see during the next 45 minutes. So the system tells me that people are still coming in. We are at 1,000, roughly 400 viewers. This is amazing. Please take the chance and ask your questions anytime in our chat. We try to answer as many of them as possible during the webinar. And in case you should have additional questions, please contact us at corporate@getabstract.com. So we will start our webinar with some, let's call it definitions. Connection culture is one of our most cited abstracts. And many people, as well as companies, found the first edition very useful to find their way through last year. So Mike, why did you write a second updated edition of Connection Culture?
Hey, first of all, Ramona, I want to thank you and getAbstract for having me on your webcast, and also thank those who joined us this morning. So the first edition of Connection Culture came out in 2015, and there's been a lot of insightful research that's happened since that time. Also, just our work with a diverse number of organizations, we've learned a lot over the last 5 years, and we wanted to provide that to people because we know that connection is essential to thrive. And this is a period when, although we're becoming more connected from a technological standpoint, we're becoming less connected from a human standpoint. And that has consequences from a biological perspective, from a performance perspective for our organizations and individual performance. And we, in the new book, we added greater diversity. We have more examples of women and people of color. We have a real mix of new organizations that we've added that we profile and have case studies of. We have new practices, including a 5-step process to operationalize connection culture. And we also added throughout the book just questions and material that will help readers apply the content in the book. So we felt it was a really important time given the rise of loneliness, stress, and social isolation, and knowing that connection is even more important now that we're in a pandemic.
So to begin with, could you tell us what are the obvious signs of disconnection?
Well, there are many. Let me just name a few. In late 2019, Cigna, the insurance company, here in the US, surveyed over 10,000 individuals using the UCLA Loneliness Scale, which is the gold standard that academic researchers use to assess loneliness. And they found over 60% of American adults tested out as lonely. So that's one example. We also know that because of the pandemic, social isolation has gone up. And that's necessary to some degree just to protect people from virus transmission. But from a biological standpoint and the effects of loneliness and social isolation, that's not good. So we have to find some ways to counter that. Just some other signs that we see right now. We know that living alone is at an all-time high worldwide. In the US, it's about 28% of the households. In Manhattan, close to where I live, it's almost 50% of people live alone. So that has consequences too. And then we also see signs, Ramona, for example, rising anxiety, stress, addiction, depression. And those are all predictable effects of rising loneliness and social isolation. So those are just a few.
Mhm. In your book, you're calling connection a superpower. What does the superpower connection do for us?
Well, I have to give credit to that phrase superpower to Matthew Lieberman, who's a neuroscientist at UCLA, and it was brilliant that he came up with that. And it's so true because, as Dr. Lieberman says, connection is a superpower because it makes us smarter, happier, and more productive. It has many other benefits, and one that's important right now is it makes us more resilient to cope with stress. And there are a number of organizational and group benefits too that I'll go through a little later on as we converse. So it really is a superpower that just helps us perform our best over the course of our lives, and it helps us feel our best. It maximizes our energy, improves our decision making. So there are a whole host of benefits that really calling it a superpower is very, that's accurate.
Okay, let's start in exercises with our audience and give them some food for thought. So we are pulling up a slide for you in a second. Wait for it. Mike, what do we see here?
Yes, Ramona, this is, and for everyone, I would ask you if you have a blank piece of paper and a pencil or a pen, pull it out and you can follow along with me. This is an exercise that we often use in workshops that we teach. And I raised this as an idea with Ramona because I think I care about those who are watching, and I'm extremely concerned now given the high levels of loneliness and social isolation and stress today. So I think this is something that could help everyone. And this is the figure of Atlas. It's actually a statue that's in Rockefeller Center, not far from where I'm today, in Rockefeller Center in downtown Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan. And Atlas is a Greek myth, and Atlas was condemned to hold up the weight of the heavens. So you can see here, now this particular Atlas is looking pretty buff, right? He's got big thighs, he's super strong, and he needs that to hold up the weight of the heavens. Now, this is a good framework to use in a sense that it helps us think about our own lives, because if we go to the next slide, we can use Atlas to think about our stressors. So the globe, the heavens, there you go. There's my little drawing that I do. I often do this just on a whiteboard and when I'm doing workshops. You can see the top, the heavens are our stressors, and the legs that Atlas has to support the weight of the stressors, we label them connection and resilience. So if you could go to the next slide, and I would encourage you to do this as we go along. You won't have as much time in this webinar to do this. It's probably better to do this or spend some more time with it after the webinar. Jot down some of the stressors in your life. And these are some common stressors that we see. A lot of people are concerned about contracting COVID, given the number of deaths we've seen worldwide. If you're working remotely, parenting from home has become a source of stress for a lot of parents whose children are learning remotely. Politics, the events in Washington, D.C. last week, that's a source of stress. We're seeing that on national surveys that a lot of people are concerned about the future of America, given just the political incivility and the things that are going on in Washington. And maybe workload, you can see some of the other issues. Racism is a source of stress, and so is trauma. We get into that in more detail in our book to explain why. Now notice at the top of the heavens is disconnection, because research shows us that when we don't have supportive relationships, it actually increases the pain of stressors. So stressors like COVID-19, we may actually worry more and feel more stress if we don't have those supportive relationships. So we think of that as being an additional stressor. Now, if we can go to the next slide. In the next slide, we look at connectors in our lives. So who are some of the individuals, the groups that help meet your need for connection? So it could be a spouse, a partner, best friend, could be your other family members, could be close friends you have. people in your community. And we do see that even little things, when you go, I've been living in Greenwich, Connecticut now for over 20 years, and pretty much wherever I go, I know someone. And I have to say, I love that. And I know from research that it's that boosts our connection, our sense of connection when we have those relationships in the community. So those are just some of the things I would encourage you to write those down. And then if you go to the next slide, we have people list out what are some of the things that you do to rejuvenate yourself, to re-energize. Number one, sleep is important. Things like diet, eating healthy, exercising resets the nervous system. It produces endorphins that give us energy and make us more optimistic. Things like just taking time to pause and be grateful for the positive things in your life. That also has been shown to boost our positive emotions. And then finally, things like prayer and meditation also have been shown to have a positive effect in terms of positive emotions and resilience. So what we often do in our exercises, we have people write these down and then spend a little time ranking them from each factor from 1 to 10. 1 being it's not very strong, 10 being extremely strong, and then processing this with a confidant or a close friend or family member. And just, what do you learn from this exercise? Do you need to boost connection in your life? Oftentimes, the research would show us that that's oftentimes the case, especially if you're experiencing anxiety, stress, low energy. You probably need more connection in your life. So this is just a framework to use to be thinking about some of the factors that we're talking about this morning.
Okay, great. So now our audience has some homework to do. Also, I have some homework to do. I was just thinking how you also might want to add like the loss of your job or performance pressure in your job to the list of stresses, and then think about what can help you to overcome that, can help you with coping with it. So, Michael, how do you define connection at work exactly?
So we define connection as a bond among people based on shared identity, empathy, and understanding that moves individuals toward group center membership. And when a group has connection and when people have those needs for connection met, it produces a number of benefits to the group. Number one, the individuals in the group have a cognitive advantage. In other words, they think more clearly. They're better decision makers. They also are more creative. Number two, that group has higher employee engagement. In other words, people give greater discretionary effort. There's tighter strategic alignment. People are moving in the same direction rather than in different directions, and so the group makes better overall progress. Because people are communicating more, that improves the quality of decisions that decision makers make. It also creates this marketplace of ideas internally that fuels innovation. And finally, when people are connected, they're more cooperative and they communicate more, so that the group itself is more adept at adjusting, more adaptable and agile to pursue external opportunities and also respond to external threats. So these are 6 different advantages that combined add up to a powerful source of performance enhancement and competitive advantage.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also in your book, you state that there are 3 different types of relational cultures. Would you briefly explain each type, please?
Sure. First of all, there's the culture of control, and that's a culture where people who have power, control, influence, and status, they rule over the rest. Now, for the rest, that's not good. It produces a condition that psychologists call learned helplessness. People feel like they basically just have to follow orders, but they don't feel much autonomy or support, and so oftentimes they feel micromanaged. It's very stressful. They're hyper criticized. And in that culture, it's difficult for people to thrive. It's actually a very unhealthy culture, both from the individual standpoint and from the organization standpoint. So that's the first culture of control. The second culture is a culture of indifference. And that's a culture where people are so busy with tasks, they don't take time to build supportive relationships. They don't really value supportive relationships. And so that hardwired need that we have for connection is not met. and they dysfunction, and that causes organizational dysfunction, including often managerial failure. The best culture is a culture where people connect, a connection culture or culture of connection, if you prefer that phrase. And that's a culture where people feel connected to their supervisor, to their colleagues that they work with. Oftentimes, especially if they're working on the front lines of the organization, they feel connected to the people they serve through their work. And these connections have a profound effect, both from a biology standpoint and from a performance standpoint. So those are the three types of cultures.
Okay, so out of curiosity, let's start a poll among our audience to see which culture they are currently experiencing. Let me pull up that poll. So it's coming. Can you see it? Yes, obviously you can because people are voting. Great. I will give people some time to vote. While we are waiting for the results, Mike, what trends are you seeing when it comes to these cultures?
Well, Ramona, for some time, for decades even, we've seen a rise in cultures of indifference. After World War II, and especially after 1960, we just saw a rise in people chasing money, power, status around the world, and a diminished value of relationships. And that means that we're just seeing more cultures of indifference, so that a need for connection is not being met. And then more recently, we've seen a rise in dictatorial leaders around the world, especially leaders of nations and in politics. And that's rubbing off in terms of just its influence on the leadership styles of leaders in organizations. Some are embracing that kind of a fighting type of adversarial leadership is the only way to produce results. And we know it may produce results in the short term or for some period, but eventually it's doomed to fail because it ultimately sabotages performance. So those are the trends we're seeing. We're just seeing a rise in disconnection and a decline in connection. And that's why this message is so important right now, that we understand why connection is so important, why disconnection is a super stressor that sabotages our performance, and that we're intentional about developing cultures of connection.
Yeah. Let me briefly share the results. I see that most people already voted. So I believe we are seeing the results. Do you see the results, Mike?
I do.
Okay, so we have 16% are working in a culture of control, 32 a culture of indifference, and 52 the majority in the culture of connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Ramona.
No, you go ahead, please.
So, this is, I would point out that the people who are attending this webinar are probably, they're different than the normal population. If we were just to go out and do a random sample, people who are attending the webinar are probably here because they value connection, and they've been intentional about putting themselves in connection cultures and cultivating connection themselves. So, but if we were to do a random sample of the population, we would see a much higher percentage of cultures of control and cultures of indifference. In fact, it would be over 50%. So we're seeing some bias, and positive bias, I would say. We have a lot of people who value connection on this webcast. So that's encouraging. I'm glad for all of you that you are in cultures of connection, because that really pays dividends in terms of just your performance, but also your enjoyment of life and your lifespan.
And for those who voted on culture of control and culture of indifference, we hope that we give you some practical advice here how to cope with it. Yeah. So there is a question from the chat, which I want to address. Somebody is asking about if connection looks differently for introverted people.
Yes, well, it's what's so fascinating about connection is it's very different depending upon our genetic makeup, the environment we've grown up with, the culture that we've grown in, that's part of our country that we're in, our local cultures. So the bottom line is people have different needs for connection. Some introverts may have lower needs for connection. Extroverts may have higher need for connection. And what's important is that we understand the symptoms that manifest when that need for connection is not being met. And things that I mentioned earlier, anxiety, depression, addiction, suicide ideation, those are all warning signs that connection may be low in one's life. So that's one thing to consider. And then there's also an important thing to think about in terms of connection, that we don't really thrive in life. Now, we may live, but there's a difference between living and flourishing. And connection is so baked into our nervous system, really into every system in our body is affected by connection, or the opposite, a lack of connection, that we need that need met if we're going to flourish, if we're going to live the life that we hope for. And so that's one of the messages of connection is you can't thrive, you can't flourish in life without having that need for connection met.
Well, let's get to some practical advice and examples. So how much time should people invest in tasks, or rather relationships then?
Yeah, once again, that's going to depend on their individual need for connection. Like I said, if they're seeing signs that I mentioned earlier that there's disconnection in their life, then they need to increase the connection. So, but there isn't really say 10% of their time on connection and 90% on relationships. It's not that simple, because it depends on the individual. But I would just encourage people to, if they read our book and learn more about our work, it'll make them understand the signs of connection, the benefits. They'll feel more energy, more enthusiasm, more positive emotions in life if they have the right amount of connection. And they're much more prone to burnout if they don't have connection in their life.
There is another interesting question from the chat in that context. Somebody's asking, how do managers or team leaders foster connection among their staff members?
Well, we have been working on this for almost 20 years, and we found a very simple, memorable, and actionable formula that managers like is, we describe it this way: vision, value, and voice. A little more elaborated explanation of that is when a leader or manager communicates an inspiring vision, when they value people as individuals and don't treat them as means to an end, and when they give them a voice to share their opinions and ideas, they feel connected. Vision plus value plus voice equals connection. So in a nutshell, it's that simple. What's so interesting about this whole area is we've been doing case studies and doing work with a wide variety of organizations. One of the earliest organizations we worked with was the engineering section at the NASA Johnson Space Center. We also do work at TCU, the University of about 10,000 students in Fort Worth, Texas, with Costco, with Yale New Haven Health and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. So a real mix, and it's what people will enjoy in the book and in the practices we lay out in the book is just seeing the variety of ways that these connecting leaders create connection in the teams and organizations they lead, and how the managers and leaders who are reading and learning about ways to connect can apply those in their workplace. But as in our workshops, I often remind people that these practices that we're talking about, they're not just relevant to the workplace. They're relevant to your life outside of work. If you're involved in community organizations or even among your family and friends, vision, value, voice is a good framework to think about in terms of, how do I boost connection and unite this group and bring more joy and productivity and really supportive relationships to each other so that we all thrive.
Okay, so let me quickly summarize in my words. You have to inspire vision, you have to give value to individuals, and you have to give people a voice to share their opinions and ideas. That's it in a nutshell, right?
Yeah, Ramona, sometimes people will confuse value with values. And another way to think of value is that people around you care for you as an individual, and they don't think just as means to an end to produce revenue and profitability. And when they care about you as an individual, you feel valued, and that connects people.
Okay, now I got it. Good you said that. Let me start another poll among our audience. Wait a sec, let me pull that up. And the question is, which of the 3 elements of connection culture, vision, value, and voice, would you like to improve in your work culture? I'm giving people a moment to answer. I could imagine that most people vote on value. It's pretty nice if your surrounding values what you're doing and what you're like adding to the company. But let's see. So almost 60% have voted. Thank you for your participation. I'll give it some more seconds. Okay, there we go. So are we seeing the results?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, we have 31 for vision, 41 for value, and 29 for voice. It's almost equal.
Yeah, and they're all important. It's one of the things we do when we assess cultures is we go in and we look at the attitudes of people in the culture, you know, the frameworks and the way they think, what they value. We look at the words, the language that's used, and we look at the behaviors, the actions. And then we think about those 3 things in terms of, do they have the effect of connecting people, pushing people from one another, or are they indifferent? And so we're seeing that value, we call value the heart of a connection culture. So I'm not surprised, as you predicted, Ramona, that value was the highest. But all 3 are important, and it'll depend upon what you presently experience in your team or department or organization as to what you're feeling you would like the most to improve in your particular culture.
There is a super interesting question coming in from the chat. Somebody's asking, some people actually use the workload as excuse or reason for not looking or establishing connection. And the question continues, how can we start helping them to see the benefits of connection? So the way I understand it, this is about how you help your coworkers, for example.
Well, that entirely resonates with me. Let me say, it just seems like our tasks lists these days are endless. And so, however, it's important to develop what we call a connection mindset. And that really comes from, as you understand more about the science of connection and the things that we've explained in the book, and hopefully we're touching on briefly here in this webinar, when we have that need for connection met, because it improves, it gives us a cognitive advantage, so we're more creative, we think more clearly, we're more rational, we have more energy and more enthusiasm. We actually overall make more progress on addressing the tasks on our task list. So in some ways, it's an illusion to think we can crowd out connection, because when connection is crowded out, it leads to individual dysfunction. We will not have, we will not be healthy from an emotional standpoint, and those negative emotions will affect our ability to do our work well. So when we find there is some optimal need of connection for everyone, just as I pointed out, depending upon genetic factors, environmental factors, their experience in the past, and when that need is met, we're going to be the most productive overall and accomplish the most on our task list.
There are more questions coming in. It's hard to choose. They're all super interesting. Here's one. In your view, is it possible to entirely compensate outside of the workplace for a lack of connection within the workplace? So a happy private life, can you compensate for a job which you don't like that much?
Boy, that is a very insightful question. So one of the things that writing the second edition of the book. Now, we wrote most of the book before the pandemic, but then when the pandemic hit, our editors, our publishers said, we're going to give you time to go back and really incorporate the pandemic because it's going to have such an impact on the future of work. And we were grateful to have those additional weeks to do that. Because what we had to do is we had to shift our thinking on this a bit. And let me just explain. When you study Karen Sobel-Lejeski, who I was just talking to a few weeks ago, is a professor at one of the state universities in New York, and Donnybrook. And in her work, she has found that the more our interactions are intermediated through digital means, the greater sense of loneliness we feel and longing for connection. So, for example, at the most extreme, if most of our relationships were in the workplace in person, and now they're all intermediated through digital means, we're going to feel a need for connection. We're going to start to feel some loneliness. And so, because of the pandemic, we're not going to be able to meet those needs in work anymore. And we're going to have to shift our thinking. How are we going to meet that need for connection through our family, our friendships in the local community are going to become much more important. Now, caveat, we have to be safe about it and figure out a way to bring people into our bubble or safety pod, whatever we want to call it, so that we have that personal need for connection met, because that's primarily going to be met with these in-person, face-to-face relationships. At the same time, we need to maintain connections with our colleagues at work. And we can do that, through Zoom, through phone calls, through text. There are many ways to do that. So we want to be intentional about that too. But step one is to understand that we have this biological need and we're going to dysfunction. We're not going to be good connectors if that need is not met. It doesn't matter what practice we employ. Number one, we have to have that need for connection met. And when we do, then we have the foundation to go out and be proactive and interact and connect with others, and that will help meet their need.
Do you have any best practices, like examples from the corporate world, which you would like to share with us?
Sure. One organization that we've done some work with and hold in very high regard is Costco. Now, Costco is a warehouse concept. They've been wildly successful. Year after year, they are listed as one of the best large company employers in the US. And if you use the vision, value, voice formula, you can think of it this way. I remember I was talking to Jim Sinegal, Costco's co-founder, and I asked Jim, how would you describe your culture? And I'll never forget this. He said, do the right thing. And I was like, what? What do you mean by that? And he said, Mike, that means we obey the law, we take care of our members, we take care of our employees, we respect our suppliers, and we reward our shareholders because we do the previous four things. And when you get into their culture, you see that there's a lot of pride in that do the right thing. People know that Costco does the right thing. They're a trustworthy organization. They really go above and beyond to make sure they take care of their members. And in terms of valuing people, you see it in their compensation and benefits practices. Wall Street's always giving them a hard time, saying that they overpay their employees, but they feel it's the right thing to do. And they also know that one of the reasons they have one of the highest employee retention ratios in their industry, the envy of all their competitors, is that they compensate their employees well. They give them generous benefits, and they also help them learn and grow through an apprentice-like training program that they really implement. It's part of their culture, is helping people learn and grow. And so that makes people feel valued. And then finally, I remember one year I was speaking to all the Costco warehouse managers worldwide who they had gathered in Seattle at their annual managers meeting. And that morning before I spoke, they showed video after video of people all around Costco who had come up with ideas to improve service to their members, improve efficiency, reduce costs, improve the employee experience. And it was phenomenal, this marketplace of ideas where they were affirming the employees who came up with the ideas. And these were people from all around the world who were part of Costco. just in short videos, sharing their idea. They were also getting these best practices out, which is a way to increase organizational learning. So that's vision, value, voice, and it means it's produced a high degree of connection. As one executive at Costco told me, connection is it's the heart of our culture at Costco. And I can only hope you're a shareholder of Costco, because they've been one of the best performing stocks since their IPO. Wildly successful.
Okay. Another question from the chat. In a world of digital, social 24/7 connectivity, the fear of missing out on information can also be a stressor. What is your opinion on the right balance?
Well, it's such a situational. I would say it really depends on the situation, but that's a great question, because I do feel that I see in many organizations that voice is not strong. We see that in our research. It's an opportunity for many organizations. And when people feel that they're not in the loop on issues that are important to them, we almost, as human beings, we almost naturally assume the worst, and it creates more anxiety. So it really shows how important it is for managers to be intentional about finding out what people are, what issues they're interested in, sharing their perspective on it, and asking people to, we actually have a process that we lay out in the book that we developed almost 20 years ago. It's called a knowledge flow process, where we ask leaders to put their ideas on the table, put their cards on the table, and say, here's what I'm thinking about an issue, and then ask people, what's right, what's wrong, what's missing from my thinking, and then just be quiet and listen. And inevitably, you'll learn new things that you weren't aware of. It'll help you make better decisions. It'll also help people, they'll feel that they have a voice. They will have a voice in decisions, and you can't always do that. Sometimes decisions have to be made quickly, but you'll learn more to make better decisions, and people will feel valued and that they'll have a voice. So that's a practice that really any manager, any supervisor, and you can also put that practice in place as an individual contributor, because you can go to the people you rely on to do your work well and say, here's what I'm thinking, what's right, what's wrong, what's missing from my thinking, how can we do our work better together? So you can apply that knowledge flow process wherever you sit, whatever role you have in an organization, and that gives people voice.
Okay, thank you. In the beginning, I mentioned that we have listeners from all over the world today, from the US, from Europe, probably also from other parts of the world. And somebody is asking, is there a difference in perception of connection, social connection, based on geography and culture, or do we all have the same view on connection?
Well, it is different. And, what we're learning from biology is that our environment affects us. So when we're conceived, to go back to conception, we inherit a genetic makeup, and that includes the relationships that our parents have had in the past are actually passed on to us in our genes in terms of how much connection we need. And then from birth on, that can change. So there is both nature and nurture involved in shaping the way people feel about connection, their needs for connection. So for example, in some cultures, making direct eye contact is not connecting. In other cultures, it is connecting. So it just shows how situational and local factors, local cultural factors really have an impact on us. So it's important to take those into account when we think about the people we're trying to influence, whether it's our family and how the type of connection culture we create, the culture we create in our community or in our workplace.
It's also a challenge for a multicultural team or for global companies.
It is, and it's really good to, what I found in multicultural organizations, when I remember one assessment we did for a multinational organization, we did in 15 languages. We assessed their culture. And for them, just getting these issues out on the table and having people share what makes them feel connected, they learned a lot about each other that really helped them work better as a team.
Yeah. So at the moment, we are all more or less forced to be isolated. We are working in our home offices. Most of our work is digital. Somebody's asking, do our digital connections, for example, video calls, meet any of our biological need for connection, or actually none of it? There's nothing about the good old hug, is what I read in that question.
Well, it's, it's early on in terms of research in this area. So there's some research that indicates, I mentioned Karen Sobol-Lejeski, and her work would indicate that, a lot of our needs are not met through digitally intermediated connection, and that may create a desire for more connection. So, but it's early on. We don't have a lot of research on this to really go on. I can only think about my personal experiences and what I've learned from interviewing people rather than quantitative peer-reviewed research that I can rely on. And I would say I do feel that some needs for connection can be met, certainly online through, we have Zoom and other GoToWebinar that we use. So just important to be sensitive to those factors that show we're low on connection, so that we can be intentional about getting that face-to-face personal need for connection, including touch, met. And so I think some combination is healthy, especially in this environment. And I for one, am grateful for Zoom. I love to be able to see people. And I do feel a sense of connection to them, even though it's over Zoom. So I think a mix. This is an area we're learning about, and we're going to learn a lot over the course of the pandemic. More research is being done and will come out in the next few months.
Yeah, you're right. There are ways to go. I mean, we've never experienced that before, and we certainly learn a lot here. So, Mike, time flew by. We are basically at the end of our time for this session. Thanks to our participants and especially to you for the lively discussion. We very much appreciate the exchange with our customers, and we hope that we could offer some value to you today. You will receive the recording of the session in the next couple of days. And again, I want to recommend to you reading Connection Culture first and/or second edition. And for more relevant content on the topic, check out the getAbstract library. There are channels such as corporate culture, leadership and development, diversity and inclusion, where you find tons of good content on the topic. So thank you very much again, Mike. Here you can see the author's contact information, and once again, the contact to getAbstract. And we are very much looking forward to hearing from you. All the best, and see you next time. Thank you, Mike. Thank you all. Goodbye.